slide, Rachel. Right. This is the slide that shows the reaction of the public to the Banat episode. We asked 3 questions here, and this slide captures all 3. One, and essentially we wanted to see the extent to which this incident damaged the PA, its credibility, its standing among the Palestinians. So these 3 questions show basically similar results, confirming that the Nizar Banat incident has really been very, very bad news for the Palestinian Authority. For example, we asked, was this a deliberate attempt to silence this and kill this opposition figure? And as you can see, we're getting almost to 2/3, more than 63% said yes, and only a 1/5 or so thought it wasn't. Clearly, lack of trust in what the PA has made public. We asked similarly on whether people supported the demonstrators who demanded the departure of the president and the government's regime change, essentially. And as you can see, there is also 63% who supported that. And finally, we asked about whether what the PA is doing is sufficient. Has the PA been quick to address this in the right way? And as you can see, even more people think it hasn't. So no doubt, at all levels, the Nizar Banat incident, and this survey came some 2 months after the incident, so this is not people just angry at the moment. And the demonstrations by the time we were in the field have already gone. So clearly, there is significant public dissatisfaction. The PA is not able to reach out to the public, isn't able to present its narrative. The PA and the public are basically in 2 different realms. The gap is huge between the 2. There is no effective communication from the PA, whether the president or the government, regarding this particular incident. The next slide focuses on a larger question, which is about elections. As you know, elections were postponed, indefinitely postponed, in the eyes of the public, canceled, and they were supposed to take place in May. So here we are in September, and we're asking people whether they want these elections to come back soon. And the answer, almost 3/4 say yes. In fact, in Gaza, even more than that. Very few, there is 1/3 in total that doesn't want to go to elections soon. Obviously, those who do not want to go to elections now are worried about Hamas and most of the opposition to holding. This is why it is higher in Gaza rather than the West Bank. This is a time where everyone realizes Hamas is really popular now, and so no elections for soon among those who do not wish to see Hamas winning. Still, despite that, we do see these are 2 questions that we've asked. One is about, do you want elections now? And the second is, do you think elections will take place soon? And as you can see, there is a huge gap between the 2. Those who do want to hold elections are about 3/4. Those who expect elections to take place are just 1/3. So clearly, there is a problem of trusting the PA to do what the public wants in this most significant issue. So we're moving from Banat to elections, the larger picture, and we clearly see the impact of Banat, and of course the cancellation or postponement of elections on this particular issue. If we go to the next slide, this is about the prisoners. Again, this was very fresh on the eyes and the minds of the public. In fact, as we were in the field, Israel was looking for the last 2 prisoners who were not captured yet. And here we ask two questions. Again, two questions that attempt to see whose narrative is the public willing to trust, that of Hamas or that of the PA. So what you see in blue is Hamas's narrative. Hamas says, I am going to release the prisoners. These 6 in particular will be among those who will be exchanged as part of a prisoners exchange. And as you can see, 81% of the Palestinians trust Hamas's narrative. They say, yes, Hamas will do this. This is an incredibly large number of people. This shows the reach of Hamas's communication. Remember what I said earlier about the PA's communication strategy. While the PA is failing miserably, Hamas, with much less, much more modest capacity, is able to actually reach a huge number of people, with 81% saying, yeah, Hamas will do this. Why? Well, because Hamas said so. That is, again, a level of trust just unprecedented in our surveys, in Hamas or anybody else for that matter. Then look at the orange or red, depending on what screen you're looking at. This is the trust in the PA protecting the prisoners. Now, we ask people whether if these prisoners reach the West Bank, the PA security services would actually protect them. Now, as you can see, only a quarter of the Palestinians think the PA will protect the prisoners. Now, I don't need to tell you that for the overwhelming majority of the Palestinians, the right thing to do would be to protect the prisoners. Clearly, the PA isn't doing well with this issue as well. So 3 issues we've looked at, and we can see in all 3 that the PA is failing. It's all bad news, whether it's about elections or prisoners or Banat. So let's see how this impacts Abbas first. The demand for his resignation. For the last 10, 15 years, since he has been president, we've asked, well, not since, but at least in the last 10 years, we've asked in every single survey about Abbas's popularity and the demand for his resignation. So let's go to the next slide, and it's about the demand for Abbas's resignation. What you will be looking at is the last, basically 1 full year between September last year and September of this year. And you can see that we have 4 waves of surveys, and in all of them, one after the other, we keep the demand keeps rising. It wasn't asked in June 21, but between March and September, you can see there is a 10 percentage point of the entire public that has moved from opposing Abbas's resignation to supporting Abbas's resignation. We have never seen 78% demanding the president's resignation. This is the highest we have ever seen. Before that, the highest we've seen was 70%. This was about 3 years ago. So clearly, almost 80% is demanding his resignation right now. There's absolutely no doubt that the issues that we have addressed in the survey that I started with are responsible for what we see in this survey. As you can see, I'm encircling the March finding, March 21 finding, where the demand for Abbas's resignation was 68%. When we look at the next slide, I'll explain why I'm highlighting this particular finding, because it was unexpected. So let's go to the next slide. And this is about the vote for the parties. The question here is, if elections are held today, which party you would vote for? Hamas, Fatah, PFLP, this or that. So we put together all the third parties, and we kept Hamas and Fatah separate. Now, you can see now we go back to December of last year, and then go to March. We see a rise in support for Fatah, a decline in support for Hamas. Then, of course, we see a dramatic change, a spike in support for Hamas and a huge decline in support for Fatah in June. There is a slight change in September that was expected, but we actually expected a lot more change than what we see here, which is very, very problematic, that the change is not as big as we anticipated. So what this slide shows, well, it shows this is the march that I encircled before, if you recall, in the previous slide when we talked about Abbas. Fatah improved its standing in March, but not Abbas. In fact, Abbas kept losing. A rising percentage demanded, a higher percentage demanded his resignation, while Fatah, in fact, managed to increase its popularity, in preparation for the elections. Why? Well, in March, when people were really taking elections seriously, at that time when we asked, a majority actually said, yes, elections will take place soon. So they expected elections to take place. And when we asked them on what basis they will vote and asked specifically about various issues, it was very clear to us that people were now worried that elections could take place and Hamas could actually win, and this could have harmful impact on them. That was not expected, but certainly as the idea of holding elections became real, people started to worry about Hamas winning elections. They didn't want Abbas president in any case and continued to want him to resign. But as far as the outcome of parliamentary elections, they wanted Fatah to win rather than Hamas. So this then was canceled, and instead we had war. Instead of elections in May, we actually had war in May. And who benefited from that? Certainly not Fatah, as you can see, from 43 to 30%, and Hamas from 30 to 41%. This is absolutely striking, the percentage of change. Now, why do I say that the change in September was very, very disappointing in terms of our expectations? Well, because we have monitored a change in every situation in the post-war surveys that we have conducted. We have found that 3 months after the elections, attitudes start to revert back to where they were before the war. And in this case, and we see significant, really significant change. But the change that we are currently looking at is not significant. Well, for Hamas it is. For Fatah it is not. Fatah isn't gaining. It isn't going back to where it was at all. Hamas is declining somewhat. Third parties are not benefiting from that. So the third parties are unable to really, whether it's elections, as you can see for March, or after the war, and there clearly, there is some increase in support for third parties, but it's not all that important in terms of the overall picture. Clearly, parliamentary elections today might not have the same results as we predicted in March of 21. But I think the basic lesson should be learned, and that is, if and when the expectation is that elections would take place and that the PA would be having a government and there is an economy to look forward to, and removing the siege or ending it and so on, it seems in terms of cost-benefit calculations, people prefer to see Fatah winning rather than Hamas winning. When it is about conflicts and war, it seems that in this case people go to Hamas because they trust that Hamas will have a response to war, but would not have a response to governance. The next slide then looks at the leaders. I've shown this slide was about the parliament, but this is the survey that we conducted in September, and it looks at what you're looking at are September findings. Haniya is paired with 3 people. Haniya is paired, by the way, because Haniya is the most popular Hamas leader, and he is the head of Hamas. So when paired with Abbas, he wins with a high percentage, even now. Again, now meaning 4 months after the May war. That is also incredible that the gap between Abbas and Haniya would remain so wide 4 months after the war. That is indeed incredible. Anticipating that Abbas isn't going to do very well, we wanted to see whether this might be just Abbas' problem. So we also asked about Shtaya, the prime minister. We want to know whether Shtaya would do better. Now, some of you want to check our findings in the past. You will see that in the past, Shtaya actually at times was able to do much better than Abbas in a competition with Haniya. Not this time. This time, in fact, he does worse. Shtaya does worse than Abbas. Haniya wins against Abbas with 56% of the vote, but with Shtaya with 60% of the vote. It's really bad news for Shtaya. To a large extent, I think the public thinks that Shtaya didn't do well with regards to all the issues that I started with. To begin with, that he basically didn't show leadership or independence from the president. And in fact, as a result, he's suffering as much as the president or more. The picture, of course, is incomplete without adding Farah's most important weapon against Hamas, which is Marwan Barghouti. Marwan Barghouti wins even when Hamas is at the peak of its popularity. This says a lot about the strength and the depth of support for Barghouti. There is no people have not seen Barghouti leading, by the way. They just somehow trust him, and he wins both in the West Bank and even in Gaza, where Hamas is most popular. In Gaza, it's almost 1-to-1. But normally this is not the case. When Hamas is not as popular, we clearly see that Barghouti wins easily both in the West Bank and in Gaza. Okay, one more slide about the domestic scene before we move to the peace process, and I understand I do need to speed things up. This is about representation. This is a question we asked last time, and it's about who should lead the Palestinian people, because Hamas intervened in the Jerusalem confrontations in May, wanting to show leadership of the entire Palestinian people. This is something that Hamas didn't show before. Hamas was focused in the past on Gaza and events in Gaza. Then they decided to basically put themselves in this larger picture where the PLO or the PA or Fatah has been leading. So we asked who should represent, who deserves to represent the Palestinian people. And as you can see, more people selected Hamas. And when you compare that to Fatah, you can see that in fact the gap is very, very wide. The gap was even wider 3 months ago, but the picture is essentially the same. This, by the way, has been regarding this question where the change from June to September was the highest. Hamas was picked by 53% 3 months ago, compared to 45%. So there's an 8 percentage point difference Hamas has lost. So the trend for Hamas to lose or to revert back is happening, and as we can see in this question, and it did happen in other with regard to other questions, but with a much smaller percentage of people changing their minds. Let me now turn to the question about the peace process. The slide we are about to see, the next slide on the two-state solution, basically asks various questions. In fact, 4 questions. One is about support for the two-state solution, for the concept. The other is about expectations regarding the Biden administration, whether the Biden administration, the victory of Biden, gives rise to expectations that the two-state solution could now become more feasible and might be negotiated. And then there is a question, direct question about is the two-state solution still feasible? And there is a question about whether a state, in fact, for the Palestinians would be created in the next 5 years. You can see support is slightly more than a third. This is the lowest we have ever seen since 1993. We have never seen the support for the two-state solution dwindling to this level. What seems to be a little bit of difference in terms of assessment is the next question about Biden, where we have 41% think Biden is good news for the two-state solution and for negotiation. It seems even those people do not necessarily decide as a result that they will support it. Some of them, of course, do. In fact, the overwhelming majority of those do, but not everyone. Feasibility, you can see only 1/3 or less think the two-state solution remains feasible. And when asked about a state next to the state of Israel in the next 5 years, as you can see, only 12% agree that this is the case. There's absolutely no doubt that the reason I'm putting all this together is also to send the message to those listening to me right now that they are linked. When we cross-tabulate the answers to these 4 questions, 3 questions, with the question about support or opposition, we very clearly see the overwhelming majority, up to 80% of those who think the two-state solution is still feasible, or that a state will indeed be established, or that Biden is good news, will support the two-state solution. Those who think it is not feasible, overwhelming majority of those have essentially decided that this is not feasible and they need to look for some other alternatives other than a two-state solution. The next slide looks at another issue that we have also been tracking over all these years, and that is the means of ending Israeli occupation. We've basically focused on 3 ways in which Palestinians can end occupation. One is about diplomacy, the other is about nonviolent resistance, and the third is about armed struggle. Now, you can see that what you see in September of last year, with about 40% or so saying armed struggle is the way forward, most effective, and about a quarter who think diplomacy and negotiations. This is not the normal picture that we see. Normally, support for armed struggle as the best means is a little lower than that. Support for diplomacy higher than what we see in September 20. Then we have the ups and downs. Most important that I want you to look at are 2 points. One that is encircled in red, where in fact the perception that armed struggle and diplomacy are the best way, or diplomacy are the best way, getting identical numbers, almost identical, 37 and 36, was when the Palestinians were preparing to go to elections in March 21. So the idea of holding elections all of a sudden brings diplomacy back into the picture, makes life more normal, diplomacy as the way to go, not armed struggle and not violence. This is very, very important. But then look at June. That is just a few weeks after the war. And what do we see? We see a decline in the belief that diplomacy is effective, and a huge rise from 37 to 49. And if you continue in September, you can see there is no change. So this actually has not changed. 3 months after the war, 4 months after the war, we still have almost half of the Palestinians who continue to believe that it is not diplomacy, it is not nonviolence, it's only armed struggle. That is the way forward. That is a significant finding because it is 4 months after the war, and by now we would have expected this to decline significantly. The fact that it isn't declining, of course, the answer to that has to be in the Israeli government, the attitude of the Israeli government, the lack of initiative on the part of the international community, and the expectation that Abbas is just too weak to take leadership with regard to diplomacy and negotiations. There is, however, the next slide, please, is about another issue. This is one level lower than diplomacy and negotiations for a two-state solution. This is about confidence-building measures. And the findings actually are surprising, because the reason they are surprising isn't because there is a majority in favor of confidence-building measures. They are surprising because at this time, when there is such a large percentage who believe in armed struggle, to support confidence-building measures, to normalize life, ease daily living conditions, that is how it is presented. Confidence-building measures that would make life easier for Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza. The fact that 55% of the Palestinians say, yes, we think this is a positive development, is very good news. Very good news for Abbas. This is one area in the entire survey where there is some level of optimism regarding Abbas having a path forward to try and achieve something for the Palestinians that this would distinguish him from Hamas. And if Israel reciprocates, and if there is indeed an Israeli interest in moving in this direction, clearly this would be one way. This is where the public, both equally in the West Bank and in Gaza, more so in the West Bank, but also a majority in Gaza, where he can move